A lot of growers come to me with the question of how they can possibly grow more food in less space. And the first step to reaching this goal is to simply learn how to grow every crop to its full potential. But once you've learned how to do that in your garden, you'll realize that there are still opportunities to grow even more food because not every crop will demand an entire growing season to produce its full yield. So in these instances, we start to use relay planting, which is the practice of growing multiple crops in the same bed in the same season. And this is where our yield per square foot really starts to escalate. So today we're going to look at some specific examples of how we're putting relay planting into practice to grow multiple crops in the same bed, even in our cold climate. And we're going to get started right here with this bed of broccoli. Now, if you're thinking this broccoli looks pretty small for a July crop in Saskatchewan, you're right. And that's because this is the second crop of broccoli that we're growing in this bed this season. So we're breaking a couple of rules here with this relay planting. First, in Saskatchewan, most people don't realize that they can grow multiple crops in the same bed in the same season, so we're doing that. And we're also planting the exact same crop in the same space, which we've done many times before with little consequence. As long as we look after our soil and meeting the basic needs of our plants, the same crop can continue to perform in the same space year after year. The way most home gardeners would grow broccoli in a cold climate with a relatively short summer would be to simply plant broccoli in the spring around the last weekend of May, harvest it when it's ready around the beginning of August, and call it done. But the problem with that strategy, if we want to maximize yield, is that we're leaving zones of empty space in our garden during the growing season when they could be producing more food for us. A better way to grow broccoli is to stretch the planting as early as possible in the season. So we planted this broccoli crop on May 8th. That allowed us to harvest it earlier on July 7th, and since our first average frost doesn't come until the middle of September, that leaves us with over 60 days of growing time in this bed that we could still use for an additional crop. There's an opportunity to plant another crop of broccoli that we wouldn't have had before. So what does it take to make a relay planting like this work? Well, the first bit of information we'll need about any crop we grow is the amount of time it requires in our garden bed. Next, we'll want to know the earliest possible date that we can plant our crop. That will depend on the last frost date in our region and our local growing conditions. And similarly, we'll need to know the latest possible period that we could plant our crop and still get it to mature before winter. Again, this will depend on factors like our first frost date and our local growing conditions in the fall. And when we find two crops that we can grow successfully at different times in the year, we can actually plan to grow both of those crops in the same bed in the same growing season with no overlap. And we could be satisfied with that, but if we're working with a short growing season, we really want to make sure that we minimize gaps of empty space in our growing beds like this to make fast transitions from one crop to the next. So the last bit of information we'll need is the amount of time it's going to take to start seeds for the secondary crop. Before crop 1 has been taken out of the bed, we'll need to start crop 2 indoors 2, 3, or 4 weeks in advance so that it's ready to transplant as soon as crop 1 is harvested. And that's what we were able to do with this example. On July 7th, when this broccoli was ready to be harvested and removed from the bed, we needed to be ahead of the game by having started another crop of broccoli indoors so that it was ready to transplant as soon as that first crop was removed. Now in the Seed to Table course, we talk about different harvesting patterns that we observe among our various vegetables in the garden. And broccoli is a tricky crop to start with for relay planting because it has a fixed harvest pattern. It's only ready during a period of 3 to 5 days, and you need to be ready to harvest it at that time. That means your planting skills for your relay planting need to be right on point so that you don't waste any growing time in your beds. So when you're just getting started with relay planting, I'd recommend that at least one of your crops is a flexible harvest crop. So let's look at some other relay planting examples that incorporate the use of crops that have a more flexible harvest window. In this example here, we're looking at a bed of corn. But before this corn was transplanted, we actually grew a full crop of carrots. We've learned through experimentation that we can stretch our earliest carrot planting back into April. And if we have them emerging by the start of May, we can get a full-size carrot to harvest by the beginning of July. And that's what we did in this case here. So on July 4th, we harvested this full bed of carrots, washed them, packed them away in the cooler to serve our family all summer long. And that freed up this space to plant an entirely new crop of corn. So instead of leaving this space empty, we're doubling our growing potential here. Now, just as in the broccoli example, I needed to anticipate this relay planting and start these corn transplants indoors before I'd actually removed the carrots. But the nice thing about starting with the carrots is that they have a really flexible harvest window. I could harvest them in the last week of June, I could harvest them in the second week of July, and the only consequence is that they'd be a little bit bigger if I wait a little longer. So if my timing isn't perfect with the start of my corn transplants, I don't have a gap of production in my garden. The only consequence is that my carrots wait a little bit longer and get a little bigger. Thanks to that harvest flexibility with these carrots, I was able to leave them in the ground until the perfect day to transplant the corn, which turned out to be July 4th this year. The corn was at the right stage for transplanting. The carrots were already mature, so I harvested the carrots and transplanted the corn in the same day. And that's the ideal scenario that we're aiming for, so that we have absolutely no wasted growing time during the peak of our growing season in July. Another relay planting example that has begun with a flexible harvest crop this year for us took place right here in this half bed, where we started the season by transplanting beets back in early May. And because of that early transplanting, those beets were mature and ready to harvest as soon as the first week of July. But thanks to the flexibility of the beet harvest window, I didn't have to pull the beets out immediately. I had some flexibility there. So since my broccoli transplants weren't ready to go in that first week of July, I could let my beets sit here and continue to get even bigger and increase our harvest for a couple more weeks until July 17th, when I finally took out the beets and transplanted the broccoli on the very same day. So again, here we're seeing how a flexible harvest window with that first crop really allows us to tighten up our transition time so that we're not wasting any productive space and time in our garden in the middle of the season. Where we don't have flexibility here is with this fixed harvest crop of broccoli. I need to make sure that this broccoli is planted on time by the middle of July in order to get a mature, large head to harvest before things freeze up and fall. So if you want to make your relay planting combination even more forgiving, you can choose a secondary crop that has a more flexible harvest window as well. Next, let's look at a couple of relay planting examples that start with a crop that has a fixed harvest and finish with a crop that has a flexible harvest. These two beds of hardneck garlic have a fixed harvest window that's predictably around the last week of July for us in Saskatchewan. And when they reach maturity at that time, I absolutely have to get them out of the ground to start the curing process. And since I can anticipate that, this is a good opportunity to plant a secondary crop following the garlic. This season I'll be replacing this northern bed with a full bed of fall kale, and the bed to the south here will be planted to spinach. Both the kale and the spinach have flexible harvest windows as they mature into fall, and we can harvest them progressively in that cool fall weather. So there's no real pressure to get them in at a certain date. We just know that the sooner we get those secondary crops in, the more growing time they'll have, and the bigger our harvest will be. The tough part about starting with a fixed harvest crop like garlic is that the harvest time isn't exactly the same from season to season. For example, last year, our garlic took a little bit longer to mature and was only pulled out of the ground on August 8th, whereas this year, we've had extremely hot weather in spring, and because of the extra heat, it's matured so fast that we'll be pulling this garlic out of the ground this week. Since that timing is a little bit harder to anticipate, our kale transplants are going to be a little bit behind, and we'll have a short gap of empty space here before those transplants go into the ground. Another relay planting example that we've got this year that's starting with a fixed harvest crop is this bed, where we're starting with a crop of cauliflower grown to maturity. This cauliflower crop was first transplanted on May 8th and harvested this week on July 16th. And in preparation for this harvest, I've already started some salad turnips inside, which will be transplanted here in the near future. But again, here my timing is not perfect because last year the same variety of cauliflower took a week longer to mature in a cooler spring. So I've got a bit of a buffer zone here before my turnips are going to be ready to transplant in this bed. So in the meantime, we'll harvest those leaves for use in juices and stir fries. And in a few more days, when the turnip seedlings are ready to be transplanted, I'll pull out the remaining cauliflower plants here, get those turnips in. Since turnips have a flexible harvest window, we can let them mature as we desire until the fall. Well, we got interrupted by a little bit of rain today, thankfully. That means we're wrapping things up here in the high tunnel. I hope these relay planting examples that we talked about today will give you the confidence to try incorporating this strategy into your own growing methods at home. Because once you've learned to optimize the growth of all of your crops, relay planting really is the gateway to doubling your yield from your growing space. Here's a quick recap for you. We started with a simple example of relay planting with two broccoli crops that both had a fixed harvest window. And I explained how you really have to know your numbers to master the timing of combinations like this. Next, I showed you examples of relay combinations that started with the flexible harvest crop to help minimize the transition time from one crop to the next, and other examples that finished with a flexible harvest crop so that harvest could extend as long as possible into the fall. Ultimately, though, if you want the most forgiving relay planting combination. Start with a flexible harvest crop and end with a flexible harvest crop. Combinations like this will make it the easiest to achieve quick transitions in your garden beds and make the best use of your full growing season. Now throughout this video I've given you a glimpse of our time-based planting system that we use to organize more complex planting strategies like relay planting, but we also use this for succession planting and companion planting. This planting method has been one of the major breakthroughs that allows us to grow our own year-round supply of vegetables now, even in a cold climate. So I've included it as one of the breakthroughs that I teach in my free workshop. If you're serious about growing your own food at home, the best place to start is that free workshop, and you can find a link to that in the video description. See you in the next one.